This is all your fault!" The man's voice cut through the howling wind as Category 4 Hurricane Elena churned toward shore just hours away. 20 angry families surrounded the small woman standing by her beat-up office trailer, their faces twisted with panic and rage. "You should have made us evacuate yesterday. Now we're all going to die because of you." Sarah Chen stood perfectly still in the chaos, her calm almost unnatural as 150-mile-per-hour winds approached. What the screaming mob didn't know was that she'd once piloted Coast Guard helicopters through storms twice this powerful, pulling drowning sailors from 40-foot waves in conditions that killed other pilots. Welcome to Silent Warriors. Comment your location if you've ever lived through a hurricane. Keep watching to see why you should never underestimate the person collecting your rent. But first, this quiet trailer park manager was about to remind everyone that some people stay calm in storms because they've flown straight through the eye of them. Sarah Chen was 42 years old, barely 5 feet 4 inches, with graying hair always pulled back in a simple ponytail. For 3 years, she'd managed Sunset Mobile Home Park, a collection of 47 aging trailers on the outskirts of Pensacola, Florida. To her residents, she was just the rent collector, the person who fixed broken pipes and dealt with noise complaints. Nobody knew her real story. Nobody asked. The park attracted people who couldn't afford anywhere else, young families scraping by, elderly folks on fixed incomes, single mothers working 2 jobs. They saw Sarah as part of the landscape, unremarkable and forgettable. She drove a dented 2010 Honda Civic, wore the same 3 polo shirts on rotation, and lived in a small apartment above the park office. When residents had problems, they came to her with barely concealed impatience. "The hot water's out again. My neighbor's music is too loud. When are you going to fix the potholes?" Always complaints, never conversations. She was the help, not a person worth knowing. During hurricane season, which seemed to get longer and more intense each year, Sarah became their unofficial weather tracker. She'd post updates on the community bulletin board, send text alerts about storm watches, coordinate supply runs to Home Depot for plywood and batteries. The residents tolerated this because it was useful, but they often complained that she was too cautious or paranoid about every little storm. What they didn't see was how Sarah watched weather patterns, how she studied satellite imagery late into the night, tracking storm formations with the intensity of someone whose life had once depended on reading atmospheric conditions correctly. How she tested the park's drainage systems before every season, calculated wind load tolerances for each trailer, and maintained detailed evacuation routes that she'd never shared with anyone. The residents had no idea that their cautious manager possessed knowledge that could save their lives. They just saw an overly careful woman who took hurricanes too seriously. Hurricane Elena had been a Category 2 when it entered the Gulf of Mexico 3 days earlier. By Tuesday morning, it was a Category 4 monster with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour, and the National Hurricane Center had just issued a dire warning. Catastrophic damage expected along the coast, storm surge of 12 to 15 feet possible. Sarah had been tracking Elena since it was barely a tropical depression off the African coast. She'd watched it strengthen over abnormally warm Gulf waters, seen the telltale signs of rapid intensification that most amateur weather watchers missed. The storm was following a path she'd seen before, a trajectory that would bring the worst surge directly to their section of coastline. She'd started preparing the park 2 days ago, sending increasingly urgent messages to residents. Mandatory evacuation orders may be issued. Please begin preparations now. Most ignored her. Some responded with irritation. Tuesday evening, she'd knocked on every door personally. "The storm has strengthened beyond expectations. You need to evacuate tonight before the roads flood." The responses were predictable. "It's just another hurricane. We rode out Ivan in 2004. The weather guy on TV says it might turn north. I'm not leaving my home for some wind and rain. Stop being so dramatic, Sarah. You worry too much." By Wednesday morning, it was too late. The evacuation routes were already flooding, and Elena was bearing down on them with the fury of a Category 4 hurricane. 43 of the 47 families had decided to ride it out. Now they were trapped, and somehow it was all Sarah's fault. The confrontation started at 10 a.m. when the first tornado warning pierced the air. Sarah was outside securing loose debris when Marcus Rodriguez, a father of 3, stormed out of his trailer. "This is insane!" he shouted over the growing wind. "My kids are terrified. Why didn't you force us to leave?" Other residents emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. The wind was already reaching 60 miles per hour, bending palm trees at impossible angles and turning rain into horizontal bullets. "You're the manager!" screamed Linda Patterson, an elderly woman who'd lived in the park for 8 years. "It's your job to keep us safe. You should have cut off our power, made us leave." More voices joined the chorus of blame. "You knew this was coming. You should have called the police to evacuate us. Now what are we supposed to do?" Sarah tried to speak, but her voice was lost in the wind and accusations. What could she tell them? That she'd done everything she could short of physically dragging them from their homes? That she'd been watching this storm develop for 2 weeks while they ignored every warning? "The weather service is saying the eye wall will hit us in 4 hours, she said, trying to project her voice over the chaos. "We need to get everyone into the community center. It's the strongest building we have." "The community center?" laughed Tom Bradley, a mechanic who'd dismissed every one of Sarah's previous warnings. "That old concrete block building?" "Lady, you're not exactly inspiring confidence here." The crowd's panic was turning to rage, and they needed someone to blame. Sarah was the obvious target, the quiet woman who collected their rent and worried too much about weather reports. What they didn't understand was that Sarah had seen what storms like Elena could do. She'd flown rescue missions through Hurricane Katrina, pulled survivors from rooftops during Hurricane Harvey, coordinated evacuations in conditions that would terrify seasoned emergency responders. She knew exactly how much danger they were in, and she knew their window for survival was closing fast. By noon, Hurricane Elena's outer bands were shredding everything not bolted down. The park's power had failed, emergency radio broadcasts were intermittent, and the storm surge was beginning to flood the access road, their last connection to higher ground. The community center, a small concrete building that served as the park's meeting hall, was packed with frightened families. 43 adults and 22 children huddled in the dark, listening to the storm tear their world apart outside. The building shook with each wind gust. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on terrified faces. Children cried while parents tried to maintain composure they didn't feel. "The roof sounds like it's coming apart," whispered Maria Santos, clutching her 6-year-old daughter. She was right. The metal roofing was beginning to peel away in sections, creating a sound like gunfire with each piece that tore loose. Marcus Rodriguez stood up, his face pale in the emergency lighting. "Sarah, you said this building was safe. It's falling apart." All eyes turned to Sarah, who was monitoring the storm's progress on a battery-powered weather radio. She'd been calculating wind speeds, tracking the eye's position, and estimating when the worst surge would hit. The math wasn't encouraging. "The building will hold," she said with certainty that surprised everyone, including herself. "But we have a bigger problem. The storm surge is going to be higher than predicted." "How could you possibly know that?" demanded Linda Patterson. "You're not a meteorologist?" Sarah looked around the room at the faces staring at her. People who'd dismissed her warnings, ignored her expertise, and blamed her for their own decisions. She'd spent 3 years being invisible to them, letting them see only what they expected. A quiet woman doing a simple job. But Hurricane Elena was about to change everything. The first sign of the storm surge came at 1:30 p.m., water seeping under the community center's door. Within minutes, it was ankle-deep and rising fast. Panic erupted in the crowded building. "We're going to drown!" screamed someone in the darkness. "The water's rising too fast! Why didn't anyone tell us it would be this bad?" Sarah waded through the rising water to the building's highest point, a small stage where the park held occasional meetings. Her mind was calculating water level, wind speed, structural integrity of the building. "Everyone get on the stage," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that had never belonged to her before. "Now." "Who do you think you are?" shouted Marcus Rodriguez. "You're just a park manager." Sarah turned to face them, and for the first time in 3 years, she really looked at them. The water was up to her waist, the roof was screaming overhead, and she no longer had time to hide what she'd been. "I'm Coast Guard Major Sarah Chen," she said in a calm but clear voice. For 13 years, I flew search and rescue missions in Category 5 hurricanes. I was at Katrina. I was at Harvey. I was at Michael. The building went silent. Only the howling wind outside and the gurgling of rising water could be heard. And I'm telling you, this building will hold, but only if everyone does exactly what I say. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The woman who had been invisible for 3 years had suddenly become the most important person in the room. Get on the stage now, Sarah said. This isn't a request. This is survival. For the next 6 hours, Sarah Chen was no longer a trailer park manager. She was a helicopter pilot with 45 lives depending on her. As the water rose to chest level, she managed group dynamics from the cramped space above the stage. She turned panic into calm. She transformed fear into hope. Wind speed is 140 miles per hour, she said, listening to the battery-powered radio. The eye wall will pass in 20 minutes. When the water reaches maximum level, it will stop. How do you know? Asked Tom Bradley, still skeptical. Because I flew through the eye of Hurricane Michael, Sarah said simply. This storm is smaller. The children weren't crying anymore. The adults weren't panicking. There was something in Sarah's voice that replaced fear with acceptance. When Elena's eye arrived, that eerie, supernatural calm, Sarah didn't let anyone panic. This is normal, she told the group. Everything will be quiet while the eye passes, then the other side will come. Be ready. And they were ready. Under Sarah's leadership, 45 people survived the full force of Hurricane Elena. When the storm passed and rescue teams arrived, everyone at Sunset Mobile Home Park was alive. Some trailers were gone, others badly damaged, but not a single person had been lost. The rescue personnel were impressed by Sarah's organization. "Ma'am," said one of her former colleagues from the Coast Guard, recognizing her, "you've worked a miracle here." But the real miracle was in how the residents looked at Sarah. They no longer called her the park manager. They called her Pilot Chen. They called her Major Chen. Marcus Rodriguez approached her, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "We didn't know." "You didn't need to know," Sarah replied. "But now you do." The park was rebuilt. Sarah stayed. But she was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the person who collected rent. She was the pilot who had saved their lives, and she would never be forgotten again. Hurricane Elena had nearly destroyed Sunset Mobile Home Park, but it had also reminded Sarah Chen who she was and taught everyone that real heroes often wait in the most unexpected places. Subscribe to Silent Warriors for more stories of hidden heroes.